Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So we were on page 93, line 3. Right here. Right. قال الشيخ المدرس رحمه الله والثانية إما علم بأحوال ما لا يفتقر إلى المادة أصلا كذات الواجب وتسمى بالحكمة الإلهية. So last session we went over the definition of hikmah. We completed that. We went over those 4 elements, and having completed that, he briefly then mentioned the subject matter of hikmah, which is here the bit about the ayan من حيث البحث عن أحوالها الواقعية. And he briefly then also mentioned its end or its goal. We went over that, and then after having defined hikmah, he gave us its main divisions. Right, there were 2 divisions that he made. One was the division of hikmah into theoretical and practical, and we saw what the basis of that division was, namely whether or not the existence, that we have knowledge of, the ones that are mentioned in the definition of hikmah, whether or not our volitions or choices have some part to play in their existence. If our volitions do, that's hikmah amaliya. If they don't, that's hikmah nadariya. Okay, and then he subdivided each division, right? And we saw what those divisions were. In practical philosophy, practical hikmah, there were ethics, household management, tadbirul manzil, and siyasa. And we saw what the basis of this division was, namely whether or not the goods, the masalih, whether or not they pertain to a single individual or not, and if not, whether or not they pertain to like a certain social unit, namely the family, or a larger social unit, like some kind of a political establishment, right? And that gives us household management and politics or political philosophy, respectively. And that's where we ended, right? That's where we ended. Any questions about that? Any thoughts? Okay. So now he moves on to the second division of that main division, namely theoretical philosophy, right? So he said here earlier, so he said وَلِكُلِّ مِنْهُمَا أَقْسَامٌ وَلِكُلِّ مِنْهُمَا أَقْسَامٌ فَإِنَّ الْأُولَى, and then he explained that. Now it's فَإِنَّ الثَّانِيَّةَ, right? فَإِنَّ الثَّانِيَّةَ. And this, as I said, is the division of hikmah into theoretical. Okay, what is he going to say is the main sort of basis of the division here? Remember the parts. So one part of theoretical philosophy was metaphysics, okay? One part was natural philosophy, and one part was mathematics, right? What gives rise to this division? Right, like in the practical philosophy, what gave rise to the division was the consideration of the goods in relation to the individual or not, or to like a group of individuals. What about in theoretical philosophy? In theoretical philosophy, according to the hukama, the basis of the division into these distinct parts is whether or not these existence that we study, in the being of which our volitions or choices play no role, whether or not these depend on matter, materiality, in some way. So he's going to say either they do depend on matter or not in order to be in some way. If they don't, then that's metaphysics. Okay? If these existence over which we have no choice, if these don't depend on matter to exist at all, then these are metaphysical things. These are things that pertain to ilahiyat. Knowledge of them is metaphysics, is what we call metaphysics. Okay? If they do depend on matter in order to be, then we can make a further subdivision. Either they depend on matter both in order to exist in the actual world and in order to exist in the mind, in our minds, or just in order to exist in the actual world, but not in order to exist in our minds. Okay? So these existence, either they depend on matter in order to be or not. If not, metaphysics. If yes, then either they depend on matter for both existing in the external world and in our minds, or they just depend on matter in order to exist in the external world, but not in our minds. So in our minds, they don't have this dependence on matter. Okay? Now, if the former of these two latter division, okay, that is to say, if these existence depend on matter for both being in the external world and being in the mind, then these are natural things, and knowledge of them is natural philosophy. Okay? But if they depend on matter just to be in the external world, but not to be in the mind, then these are mathematicals. These are mathematical objects. Knowledge of them is mathematics. Okay? So the basis of this division of the main branches of theoretical wisdom or philosophy, hikmah nadariya, is the dependence or the lack thereof on matter of these mawjudat in whose being our choices have no influence. Okay? Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yeah, just a question.
Yeah.
Is there there's also a specific understanding of matter, right, in this regard?
Yeah, there is. He's going to clarify that. We'll get to that in one of the footnotes, one of his footnotes. I believe it's footnote 5. Okay, footnote 5 is going to be a response to a hypothetical objection, as we'll see. But that's the main division. Okay, he's going to precisify that with regards to the dependence on matter clause with regards to those things that depend on matter for being in some way. But that's the main division, is this: depend on matter or not. If not, metaphysics. If so, either depend for existing in the external world and in the mind, or just in the external world. If the former, natural philosophy. If the latter, mathematics. Okay? So if we go back to the text now, and we look at what he says, he's going to bear out this claim, and he's going to give some examples as well. Okay? So, page 93, line 3, وَثَانِيَةً. The second, i.e., theoretical wisdom, is either a knowledge of the states of that which does not depend on matter aslan at all. Okay, like what? Like, for example, God. كذات الواجب, like the essence of the necessary being. Okay? In philosophy, God is called as the necessary being. Like God, God's existence is not a material existence, according to, you know, the mainstream position of the hukama, of the mutakallimin, of the urafa. God is an immaterial entity, right? He exists without being tied in some way to materiality, right? At all. Okay? If these beings, or the states of these beings, are not dependent on matter at all, like, for example, God, like God's existence, تسمى بالحكمة الإلهية. That's called metaphysics, or wisdom about divine things, or philosophy pertaining to divine things. Okay, حكمة إلهية. Right?
Just the translation from Bethania.
وَالثَّانِيَةِ, as for the second, okay, i.e. the second division, okay, إما علم بأحوال ما لا يفتقر إلى المادة, either it is a knowledge of the states of that which does not depend on or need matter, okay. The ma there refers to the mawjud khariji. Ahwali, the states of that which, i.e. the external existent that was mentioned in the definition of hikmah. Okay, the states of the external existent does not depend on matter at all, aslan. Like the essence of the necessary being. Should probably capitalize necessary, the necessary, right? And that's called hikmah ilahiyya. Or it is a ilmun بأحوال ما يفتقر إليها. إليها يعني إلى المادة. Right? So it's either a knowledge of the states of that which does not depend on matter, or it's a knowledge of the states of that which does depend on matter. Right? So imma this or this. Okay? That's how the syntax of the passage works. Okay? Or it's a knowledge of the states of that which does depend on it, i.e. matter. فِي الْخَارِجِ دُونَ التَّعَقُّلِ, in the external world, but not in our thought. Okay? In the external world, but not our thought. So it depends on matter, but only to exist in the external world, not to exist in our thought as an object of our thought. Okay? So when you, and this is going to be what he's going to call mathematics. Okay? So mathematical objects, unlike metaphysical objects, are going to be objects that, in order for them to exist outside the mind, they have to exist connected to some matter. Okay? Some definite kind of matter. Say like, wood, right? So you have a wooden triangle, right? You don't have triangularity out there just by itself. Contra Platonism, right? So he's assuming here the falsity of Platonism about mathematical objects. Okay? You don't have that. What you have is you have it always in some specific matter. Some wood, some, chalk, some paper, and so on and so forth. Okay? However, in order to think about triangularity, you don't need to think about any specific material, right? Like wood or paper or plastic or whatever. Okay? There's a kind of matter quote unquote, involved in thinking about mathematicals, but he's going to clarify that. But it's not the sense of matter relevant here in terms of the division. Okay? But the point for now is that in order for these objects to be, they are connected to matter, specific kind of matter in the external world, but not in the mind. Okay? That's why he says they depend on matter في الخارج دون التعقل. Right? What's an example? كالكرة وتسمى بالحكمة الرياضية. Like, for example, the kurra, which is a kind of it's like an orb. Okay, it's a circular or like a globe, right? An object that has that shape, kurra. Okay, that shape, a kurra is some like material thing with a certain shape. Okay, a globe-like shape or a circular shape or a spherical shape, right? This sphericity, it's being a sphere, must exist in that kind of object. Okay, let's say that wooden object or that plastic object or whatever other material it's made out of. It can't exist in the external world just by itself. Okay, but when you think about its shape, okay, its spherical shape, it doesn't, you don't need to think about, the specific material that it's connected with in the external world, like the wood or the plastic. So it's independent of that. Okay, in a way that, as we'll see, the objects of natural philosophy are not. Okay, they can't be stripped from the specific material that they are connected with in the external world, whereas mathematical objects can. Okay, this is why he says, if these objects depend on matter fil kharij but not in thought, like the orb, then knowledge of them is called hikmah riyadiyya, mathematical hikmah. أو في التعقل أيضا. Okay, so, or it's a knowledge of that which depends on matter في الخارج and في التعقل. Okay, في الخارج and في التعقل also. Okay, like human, and in that case it is called al-hikmah at-tabi'iyya, and in that case it's called natural philosophy. So the objects of natural philosophy depend on matter both in the mind and outside the mind. Okay, so something like, let's say, in order for a human being to exist, he has to exist in, say, flesh and blood, a certain kind of flesh and blood, and other kinds of matter. Okay? And to think about a human, you also have to think about this kind of matter. Okay? You take this kind of matter in your tasawwur, in your conception of human. Okay? You can't think human apart from that, in the way you can think a triangle apart from wood or plastic or any other specific kind of matter. With human or animal or, I don't know, a heart, you can't do that. Right? Here, remember, we're assuming that you have like a proper conception of the object. Right? And that's called hikmah tabi'iyya. Now, each of these, as I said last session, has branches, each of these three divisions. Okay, it has certain furu, right? And Sheikh Mudarris here, with regards to hikmah ilahiyya, mentions some of them in the first footnote 4. He says, وَمِنْ أُصُولِهَا بَحْثَ الذَّاتِ وَالصِّفَاتِ. Yeah, okay, so among the kind of fundamental metaphysical subjects is the discussion about theology proper, when you talk about, the nature of God and the attributes of God, right? But it also has some furu, some branches, and among them من فروعها بحث النبوة والإمامة والمعاد. And among its branches are the research into prophecy, the nature of prophecy, and imama, and eschatology. Right? These are subjects also treated in metaphysics. If you look at the standard works of hikmah or kalam, you find this. Right? Now, going back to hikmah riyadiyya, mathematics, we said that, or he said that, okay, its objects, knowledge of its objects, it's a knowledge of objects that do depend on matter, but only to exist outside the mind, not in the mind, right? Like the example of the sphere that he gave, right? Now, someone can say here, well, don't mathematical objects also in some way depend on matter in the mind? Right? Isn't that the case?
Do you mean, if I may, like
yes,
depend on matter in the mind as being a concomitant matter, right? Because if we take some of the concomitants of matter, like we would say that the shape of the material object would be a concomitant, and so would the number. So it's not completely stripped of the concomitants of matter. Is that kind of what you mean when you say it still somewhat depends on matter?
The concomitants of matter. Well, yeah, that's a kind of dependence. That's true. Yeah, I mean, one can raise that question as an objection, right? One can say exactly that. I can say, well, don't they in some way depend on matter in the mind insofar as you have the concomitants of matter in the mind, right? So, like, what does he mean here? Right, so I'm taking your question and I'm sort of turning it into an objection against what he says here. Right?
Because like it reminded me, because when I was reading some of the psychology, the Sheikh says that some of the forms that are impressed on the intellect are completely stripped of matter and comment. So I guess I thought into my mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that mathematical objects, right, like, which are things like shapes and sizes and so on and so forth, those are concomitants of matter in the external world, right? But here, the question is about whether or not, in order for a shape to exist, okay, does it have to exist in some matter in the mind, in the way it has to exist in some matter in the external world, right? Like, a given shape can't exist outside the mind without existing in, let's say, wood, right? But that's not the case when it has to exist in the mind. It doesn't have to exist in wood in the mind. I could conceive of it apart from wood. I could think about it apart from wood. But can I think about it apart from any matter? Right? Or is there some kind of material substrate also involved in the conception of these mathematicals? Just like how there's a definite material substrate involved in the existence outside the mind of mathematical objects.
You would say that these mathematical properties that are properties of material objects externally, we know them via the estimation.
Yeah.
Just like we know joy in them. So I mean, we would say you could know joy without joy being part of matter in your mind as conceptualized.
Yeah.
So I don't see why that. So maybe similarly, we could say the same thing of mathematics, right? When you think about something like that.
That we can well, yeah, right. That you can think about them without any specific kind of matter, right?
Yeah, but I think your concern is that, like, well, could we think about them without any matter whatsoever, whether the specific object they're hearing or it's in common?
Yeah, in the way, for example, we can about metaphysical objects, right? Which, as he says, don't depend on matter aslan at all, So that means neither in the mind nor outside the mind.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like mathematical objects are of that sort.
Yeah. So the objector, the hypothetical objector, is sort of, you could say, if we interpret him charitably, he's asking for like clarification here. Like in what way are they without dependence on matter in the mind? Because presumably there's some kind of dependence on matter even in the mind, he thinks, because when you think of when you're doing mathematics, you are performing operations on these objects, okay, which operations presuppose some kind of substrate, okay, and he's going to clarify that in this footnote, right? In what way they are without matter in ta'aqqul, in the mind, in cognition. Okay, so if you turn to footnote 5, he's going to say, look, they are without matter in the sense of without a specific definite matter, right? But they do have some kind of general matter also in the mind, some kind of like vague material substrate, okay? And he doesn't say this here, but this is what allows them to be objects on which you can perform certain kinds of operations, okay, that are characteristic of mathematics, like addition, subtraction, division, and so on and so forth. Okay, you can't do these sorts of things with purely immaterial things. That's not properly so they're not properly like mathematizable in that way. But with mathematical objects, or like for example shapes, right? Like you can divide a shape in your mind. Okay. Now that division can only take place in virtue of them having some vague absolute matter, as he says. Right? It's not a definite matter. It's not like you're not thinking of like, a wooden triangle or a triangle made out of steel or plastic or whatever when you do that, but there's still some kind of a vague material substrate. Aristotle calls it in several places intelligible matter. Okay? This is characteristic of mathematical objects. So in the mind, they're abstract from, you could say, material matter, but not intelligible matter. And this is what allows them to be subject to mathematical operations like division and addition and so on and so forth. Okay? That's why he says, موضوعها لم يؤخذ من حيث اشتماله على المادة المخصوصة. Their subjects are not taken insofar as they contain a specific matter, okay, like wood, plastic, or whatever. Fit ta'aqqul, in the mind, right? It's not a specific matter, like the way it is with natural objects. Okay, if you're thinking of human that consists of plastic, you're not thinking of human. You haven't conceptualized human. If you're thinking of a heart that consists of steel, okay, that has steel in the definition, you're not thinking of a heart. Okay, you got to conceptualize with the specific matter that it's connected with in the external world. Okay, but with mathematicals, this need not be the case. You don't need to take in being wood or being made out of wood in the definition of, let's say, triangle. Okay, that's why he says they're not taken insofar as they contain specific matter. لم يؤخذ من حيث اشتماله على المادة المخصوصة في التعقل. Even though أخذ من حيث اشتماله على المادة المطلقة. It's not taken with specific matter in the mind, but it is taken with a kind of general matter in the mind. Madda mubhama, a vague matter, or an intelligible matter, if you like. Okay? And like I said, this is what allows them to then be subject to those mathematical operations in the mind. Okay, like division, right? Like say, okay, divide the triangle in half, right? That involves some vague or general or intelligible substrate, right? And that, they are conceptualized with that, but not a specific matter. Like it need not be wood or plastic or what have you, right? What do you think? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that.
I mean, you're the mathematician, so you would have some more you would have a better conceptualizations of these mathematicals, right? Do you see what he means though?
I guess I'm trying to understand, like, what does he, how am I really supposed to think about this intelligible or vague matter, right, in distinction the kind of matter that we think about in the ordinary sense, right? So, like, what kind of substrate would that be, this intelligible or vague matter?
Well, I mean, you can't think of it as some definite material substrate.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's precisely what's being denied.
But, yeah.
Right? You don't need to conceptualize triangle, you don't need to conceptualize, let's say, wood, right?
Okay.
Or any other definite material substrate. Okay? They're definitionally independent of any specific madda.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, that's fair. So I guess when I ask, well, what kind of thing it is, I guess maybe the presumption there is I'm looking for something definite, which is okay.
Yeah, exactly. So that's ruled out. But he says they still have kind of madda mutlaqa, a kind of general or a vague, a nebulous kind of matter or intelligible matter. Okay, and this is what makes them susceptible of certain
But why are we
operations.
positing this?
What?
Like, why are we positing this vague intelligible matter? Like, I'm trying to understand, like, is this just something that we're, inserting in order to kind of make sense of these mathematical properties? Like, I'm trying to understand why we're, like...
Yeah, we're positing this to explain how they could be subject to those operations that we subject them to in mathematics, like addition, subtraction, division, and so on, right? Because purely immaterial objects cannot be subject to those things, right? Like you cannot divide the soul.
But instead of positing it, like positing this vague intelligible matter, why don't we just say that, look, it simply doesn't require matter, and that these operations are done purely on the basis of the properties. There's no substrate there, and that's why mathematics. What do you think about something like that?
Purely on the basis of the properties?
Yeah, so like, I have something like 2 and 2 and I get 4.
Yeah.
Like, do I have to assume the substrate of 2 as some like general intelligible object in order to do those operations? It seems to me like I can perfectly do them without assuming that, right?
So you want to say you can add without assuming that matter.
Is this maybe, well, perhaps this is like, I think what the Shaykh is trying to get at here is that, like, this is a problem in principle, because for any like property that we know via estimation, we usually say it's coming from like some kind of substrate. So we can't just separate the substrate completely. I think that's what he's coming at. But he also doesn't want to say, as we've shown, that's a definite matter. And so he says it's a general one. But I guess I just don't really understand like get what it means to be this vague, intelligible matter that we're positing here.
Yeah, I mean, his motivation for it is to really explain, like, this idea that I mentioned of them being subject to certain operations that they couldn't otherwise be subject to, right? And his standard examples usually are like geometrical, right? He says, in a sense, with regards to objects of arithmetic, okay, number, he says, in a sense, you can apply number to purely immaterial things, right? However, he says that this is not number in the mathematical sense, or the sense that's involved in when you're doing mathematics. This is a more transcendental sense of number, right? But when you're doing mathematics, he says, and you're doing like things like addition and subtraction and stuff, and especially in geometry, when you're carrying out certain operations like divisions and the like, he says that, you know, there has to be this vague matter, right? And you don't need to, it need not be, I mean, you shouldn't try to conceptualize it as something specific.
Consider a triangle, and this is like the last thing I'll ask, I don't want to take too much of the time with the lecture, but consider a triangle, right?
Yeah.
So he would say something like, the kind of substrate it has is not some definite material object, it's something that's vague and intelligible of that triangle, right?
It's something what?
It's something vague and intelligible, substrate.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So is this not like, similar to like kind of what Plato's going to say in some sense, in this, that like there is this intelligible thing and triangularity kind of like mirrors it in some sense, the shape that we have in our mind, or am I missing?
No, the Platonist position is that triangularity can exist outside the mind without existing in any matter.
Yeah.
Right? That's his position. The view of the Mashayikh is that no, it has to always exist in some matter, right?
Yeah.
Some specific matter. But that's not the case when you conceptualize the triangle. However, even he says in one place, even when you conceptualize the triangle, there's something like some parts of its definition sort of play the role of matter, and some other parts play the role of form. Although, you know, he says it's like matter or like form, right? It's not strictly matter and form, but it's analogous to them. That's I think a good way to put it. There's something analogous to sensible matter in the mind when we conceive of mathematicals, and that's why we can perform the operations that we do perform on them, like division, right? How do you divide a triangle, right? What is it that receives the division? What does the division take place in? So he thinks this is all that we mean when we say madda mutlaqa, right? So they're not purely immaterial in the mind too, in the way that something like, for example, God would be, right? Or like the idea of a cause, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So it's really about just being able to account for how we can carry out these mental operations on them, right? How we're able to carry them out. That's what really motivates positing this madda mutlaqa, or something analogous to sensible matter with mathematical objects that Aristotle calls intelligible matter.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth thinking about more. So Sheikh Mudarris gives two responses to this kind of worry. That, okay, don't these mathematicals also have some kind of matter? So how are they independent of matter in the mind? One answer is that the one we just canvassed, which is they're independent of a specific matter, not matter absolutely, or vague matter, or intelligible matter, right? Or something analogous to sensible matter. Okay? The second answer he gives is he says that This division, okay, is one that the ancient philosophers made, and they only sort of inquired into, when they did their astronomical investigations, they only inquired into the spheres, okay, where the sphere is understood as just the shape, okay, and not the thing that has the shape or the composite of the two, okay. And the sphere as such, taken as such, is a mathematical object, right? Right, and so they just concerned themselves with that. They didn't take into account all, when they were doing their astronomy, the object that is spherical in shape. So they didn't consider the matter, okay? They just considered the shape itself, which as such is mathematical in nature, and which as such does not depend on any specific matter to be conceptualized. This is why they said, these mathematical objects depend on matter to exist outside the mind, but not inside the mind. Okay? So, in other words, he's saying, this is just a result of, to the objection. He's saying this is just a result of the way that the ancients divided the mathematical sciences or the philosophical sciences based on the way that they did astronomy, namely by just looking into the sort of mathematical features that the heavens or planetary motions or planetary objects instantiate. They were just interested in that purely from a mathematical point of view, not from a physical point of view, right? And so they saw the shapes that these astronomical objects instantiate, and these were Yeah. There's actually a good paper by Zarepur on this that we could look into, where he explains this in some more detail. But that's just the gist of it. It's this idea of precisely like what we do when we subject these objects to certain operations and what allows that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So okay. Yes, Brother Zain is here. So. Yeah, basically the second response is just saying that, because the ancients did astronomy in this way, where they just considered that the mathematical properties of these heavenly objects, they defined mathematics in that respect, right? By just focusing on the form and leaving out the matter completely, right? Which is why he says, or, i.e. by way of response, we can say that أن هذا التقسيم, okay, this division, right, لأوائل الحكماء, belongs to the ancient philosophers, وهم لم يبحثوا في علم الهيئة إلا عن الدوائر, and they did not inquire in astronomy except into the spherical or circular shapes, i.e. that belong to the physical objects. In this case, the astronomical objects. فإنهم كانوا يعبرون عن كل فلك بدائرة. For they, referred or called each like falak, which is a heavenly body, the sphere, as a da'ira, as like a circle, a circular thing. Yeah, something spherical. Right, which kind of puts this emphasis on its mathematical feature, right, as opposed to its physical one. And for that reason, وَلِذَلِكَ, okay, because astronomy was just about like these dawa'ir for them, سُمِيَتْ هَيْئَتُهُمْ بِالْهَيْئَةِ الْبَسِيطَةِ. So they called their astronomy like simple astronomy, right? I.e., that just deals with the mathematical features. And they called the Hay'atul Ukhara'i or Hay'atul Ukhra bil Hay'atil Mujassama. They called the other Hay'a, the one that also takes into account the states of the actual physical object. They called it like you can say, yeah, like a bodily astronomy or material astronomy. Let's say formal and material astronomy. The formal just deals with the mathematical properties the heavenly bodies instantiate, and the material astronomy deals with also physical facts about the
the former could be understood like theoretical astronomy, modern day, right?
Yeah.
They're like analyzing,
yeah, something like that, exactly, right? Okay, and then he mentions some of the fundamental branches of ilm or al-hikmah al-riyadiyya, mathematical wisdom, and some of its fundamental divisions and some of its secondary ones. Okay, so this is in footnote 6. He says, وَأُصُولُهَا الْحَنْدَسَةِ وَالْحِسَابِ وَالْهَيْئَةِ وَالْمُوسِقَةِ. Right? This is the standard division of the mathematical sciences into 4 main branches, namely geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. Okay? ومن فروعها علم المناظر والمرايا وعلم الموازين ونقل المياه والجبر والمقابلة وعلم الحيل كصندوق الساعة وأمثالها كصندوق الساعة وأمثالها وعلم الزيجات والتقاويم. And among its branches are the science of optics, I think, of optics and mirrors, and the science of scales, and I'm not sure what naqlul miyah is. It's like some kind of body of knowledge that has to do with transferring vessels of some sort. Algebra? Huh?
This is for natural.
No, this is mathematical.
Oh, still.
Yeah, this is mathematical. So this is among the branches of mathematical, right? So optics and science of mirrors, okay, so which has to do with like certain properties that certain reflectance properties that mirrors exhibit and the like.
Like refraction.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the science of scales and naqlul miyah, I'm not sure what that is, vessel transfer. Al-jabr wal-muqabala, algebra, right? The science of mechanical devices, right? Ilm al-hiyal, like, yes, exactly, something like engineering. And then he gives an example of that, I guess, Kisanduq as-sa'a and the like. And also the science of astronomical tables and calendars. So all these are branches of mathematics. Okay. So that's hikmah riyadiyya, right? As for hikmah tabi'iyya, whose objects, as we said, depend on matter both for their existence outside the mind and inside the mind. Okay? About that, he says, this is footnote 7, right? He says, it's called hikmah tabi'iyya. Why is it called that? He says, because يبحث فيها عن الجسم من حيث اشتماله على الطبيعة. Because it investigates, because in it, what is investigated is the body, or is body, insofar as it contains a nature. Namely, al-madda wal-suratul ayniyya. Namely, matter and concrete form. That's what the nature of a body consists in. Namely, its matter and its form. That's why it's called hikmah tabi'iyya. because it investigates tabi'ah, which is madda wa sura. Okay? And among its branches, من فروعها علم الطب وأحكام النجوم والفلاحة والتشريح الأبدان والجر الأثقال. And among its branches is medicine and astrology and agriculture and anatomy and Jar al-Athqal is like a science that has to do with like towing or dragging weights. Right.
McGinnis also mentions like psychology. Psychology for the Shaykh was part of the natural.
Yeah. That's, he doesn't mention it, but that's one of its usul.
Yeah.
It has several usul, which he doesn't mention here. But he just mentions why is it called natural philosophy? Because it studies nature, which is form matter. And he mentions some of its branches. But yes, that's right. Among its usul are like ilm al-nafs and other branches. Right? Okay. So with that, he finishes the point about the divisions of hikmah and the basis of the divisions. Now he moves on to a consideration of logic. Where does logic fit in this? Right? Remember that he said he wrote this treatise in order that beginning students have an easier time learning logic. Right?
Yeah.
So we talked about these different sciences and their places in either hikmah nadariya or amaliya, but he hasn't said anything about logic. Now he's going to turn to logic. What about logic? What's the status of logic? Where is it in the scheme of the sciences? Is it a science or not? And if it is, which science does it belong to? Right? Does it belong to theoretical science or practical? Right? And if it belongs to, say, theoretical, which theoretical science does it belong to? Is it one on its own, or is it a part of one of the three fundamental were mentioned? Right? He's going to say there's actually a disagreement about this. There's a disagreement about this between the theoreticians. Some of them say, it's not a science. Others say it is. And this disagreement actually goes back to the ancients, right? It goes back all the way to the Greek tradition. According to the standard Masha'i view, right, the standard Aristotelian view, one second, hold on. So the disagreement about this goes way back. And as I was saying, the standard view of the Peripatetics in the Greek tradition, and also in the Arabic tradition that follows the Greek tradition closely, is that logic is not a science in itself. Rather, it's an instrument of the sciences. Okay? And this opinion, not to go too much into this, but this opinion basically is one that the Shaykh, when he comes to deal with it, opposes. And he says, actually, this whole disagreement, okay, on this question is between the ancients and also the moderns, right? Like among the ancients, the Stoics had a certain position, the Peripatetics, as I mentioned, the Platonists had another position, and then people took similar positions in like the Arabic tradition. He says that, the disagreement is actually lafzi. It's a verbal disagreement. And he takes the view that logic is both. It's both a science, that is, and an instrument of the sciences. But it just depends on various considerations. Under one consideration, it's a science. On its own. On another consideration, it's not. It's just an instrument for doing science, right? He says this is not a substantive disagreement, right? We'll leave out the details of why he says what he says. We can look at that maybe another time. But that's the view he takes. Sheikh Mudarris here, okay, he takes the view that logic is not a science, and it's only an instrument of the sciences. And the reason he does this, as we'll shortly see, is because of the way that he defined hikmah earlier, okay? Or the way that he understands a particular part of that definition, as we'll see. Remember the definition that... Can you guys see the screen or no?
I can't see the screen.
What about now?
Okay, I can see now.
Okay. Remember that definition. That definition was that حكمة is an علم بأحوال الموجودات الخارجية على ما هي عليه في نفس الأمر بقدر الطاقة البشرية. Sheikh Mudarris is going to have a certain view on what al-mawjudat al-kharijiyya means. And based on that, he takes a position in this debate on whether or not logic is itself a science. He, as I said, comes down on the side of saying, no, it's not. Okay? And the reason is because he says, philosophy is about external existence, the states of external existence, where external existence means things that are outside the mind. Okay? Now, logic deals with things, or notions rather, that only exist in the mind. Thus, it's not part of philosophy. It's an instrument for philosophy. Because philosophy is about the knowledge of the states of external existence, not mental beings. Right? And therefore, logic, which is about mental beings, or about notions that only exist in the mind, it's not a part of philosophy, or it shouldn't be considered part of philosophy. That's his view, right? Which is based on understanding al-mawjudat al-khariji in a specific way. Those who consider logic as a part of philosophy, as a part of hikmah, they, when they define hikmah, do not mention this clause in the definition, namely al-kharijiyya, right? So when they define hikmah, they say hikmah is an ilmun bi ahwal al-mawjudati ala ma hi alayhi fi nafs al-amri wa ila akhirih. And on the basis of that, they take the view that logic is part of philosophy, part of hikmah, okay? Because it's a knowledge of the states of existence, right? They don't specify that the existence should be external existence. They just say existence full stop, and that's inclusive of external and non-external or mental. And therefore for them, logic is a science itself. Okay, so these are the two main positions. Of course, someone can, as I mentioned the first session, leave this kharijiyya clause in the definition, but interpret it more broadly, as only being exclusive of certain entities in the mind, namely fictional entities. Okay? And even on that reading, we can make room for logic being included in philosophy, because it would then deal with, it would then be a knowledge of the states of external existence, external in the broader sense of just not being something invented by the mind, right? So I think under that reading too, we can accommodate logic as a branch of philosophy, right? But Sheikh Mudarris doesn't take that view. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it seems to me right that like logic is, properly speaking, a science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, my view tends to be that of the Sheikh. It just depends on the consideration, right? And the explanation for that is a bit different, but I think that you're right that it can be taken as a science itself, with its own subject and principles and the rest of the requirements of a science, right? But Sheikh Mudarris, because of how he understands the definition of philosophy, and especially the kharijiyya bit in that definition, he opts for the view that it's not part of hikmah itself, right? This is why I said I think
It's consistent,
right?
least, right?
Yeah, it's very consistent. This is why I said in the second session that based on what he says later on in the text, I have to modify what I said in the first session, namely that he takes the view that al-mawjudat al-kharijiyya is to be understood in this broad sense of khariji. That's actually not the case for him. Kharijiyya should be understood on his view in the specific sense that's exclusive of mental beings, whether they be fictional or not. This is why he says logic, which deals with mental items that are not fictional, and yet it's still not a part of philosophy for him. It's only an instrument of philosophy. قال واختلفوا في أن المنطق من الحكمة أو لا. Right? They have a disagreement. Who are they? The theoreticians, the rationalists, the uqala, about whether or not logic is part of philosophy or not. And على الأول, and on the first view, namely, they disagree also on whether or not on the first view, i.e. the view that it is part of philosophy, what part of philosophy does it belong to? Right? So, is it a part of philosophy? And if it is, what part of philosophy does it fall under? Right? من أي قسم منها يعني من الحكمة. And he says here والمقام okay لا يسع تفصيله. The current place does not allow to sort of elaborate on that discussion. Right? He says basically space is restricted. I can't go into details here. However, in the footnote, the last footnote, 8, he goes into a bit of detail and reveals his position, which, as I mentioned, is that it's not to be taken as a part of philosophy for the reason mentioned. قال والحق, the truth is that logic ليس من الحكمة. Logic is not part of philosophy. Why? Because لا يبحث إلا عن المفاهيم التي لا وجود لها في الخارج. Because it only investigates the concepts or the notions that have no existence outside, i.e. the mind. On the contrary, بل, so you can put a period there, بل المنطق من مقدمات الحكمة. Logic, on the contrary, is from the preliminaries of philosophy. Why? Due to its لإفادته قوة الذهن في فهم مسائلها, because of its benefit to the power of the mind, because of its bestowing it's bestowing sort of power to the mind to understand the issues of hikmah. Okay? In other words, it strengthens the mind's ability to be able to do philosophy, to understand its issues and so on and so forth. Right? في فهم مسائلها يعني مسائل الحكمة. وإذا فرضنا, this should say, it should be a fa, I think. However, he says, if we assume that it is part of hikmah, okay, what part of it would it be? And he's going to say, what seems to be the case is that it is a part of metaphysics. Why? Because its subject matter, like the subject matter of metaphysics, is independent of both matter to exist outside or to exist in the mind. Right? Or it's just independent of matter in that way. وَإِذَا فَرَضْنَا أَنَّهُ مِنَ الْحِكْمَةِ, and if we suppose that it is from philosophy, belongs to philosophy, فَالْأَشْبَهِ أَنْ يَكُونَ مِنَ الْحِكْمَةِ الْإِلَهِيَّةِ. What seems to be most the case is that it is from metaphysics, because موضوعه مستغن عن المادة. Right? موضوعه is independent of matter. لأن موضوعه مستغن عن المادة. Right, just like metaphysics. Right? So at the very least, it's like closer to metaphysics. Okay, because its subject, like the subject of metaphysics, does not depend on matter in the mind at all. Right? It's not like the subject of mathematics, which, although it doesn't depend on a specific matter when it's in the mind, it does depend on general or vague or absolute or intelligible matter. Right? As we mentioned.
So actually,
Now.
oh, sorry. I was going to say, so the Sheikh doesn't consider like logical principles to be, properties of matter, but they can be conceptualized without the specific matter.
Logical
principles? Yeah. So like if you take something like mathematical principles be properties of matter externally.
Yeah.
But they need not be conceptualized with that specific matter per se, whatever properties be conceptualized.
Yeah.
But rather with a more general or vague matter. Okay.
Yeah.
Could we say the same thing about logical principles, like the principle of non-contradiction, identity? Can we say the same about those as well?
No, we can't, because if you can, we need a reason, but the reason why we posit that in the case of mathematicals, we don't, that reason is not applicable in their case, because they're not the sorts of things that are subject to mathematical operations. Right? I mean, what would it mean to divide?
Yeah, like the principle of non-contradiction, for example.
Yeah, or just let's say like divide a species. Divide in the sense that's relevant to mathematics, right? Not divide like into its individuals,
Yeah.
But divide in the sense that's relevant to mathematics, which is a kind of like this quantitative division. Okay? This is what's important, because mathematics deals with quantity, okay? And quantity always involves some matter.
I see.
And quantity is what allows for the division and other operations that we carry out in mathematics. And that is why, the objects, even though they're independent of specific matter, there's still this kind of intelligible quantitative matter.
Okay, I see.
Right, which is absent in purely immaterial beings. That's why the Shaykh says, numbers taken non-mathematically, or numbers applied to immaterial things is used non-mathematically, because we're not talking about quantities here.
Yeah.
Right, discrete quantities. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a more transcendental, metaphysical sense of one, which pertains to like unity and the like and identity, but not number, quantitative. Right, and in logic, that's absent too. Right, so we don't then need to posit a kind of intelligible matter in which they subsist in the mind, or with which they're conceptualized. Okay, so in that respect, they resemble, as I said, فَالْأَشْبَهِ, they resemble more the objects of metaphysics than they do mathematics, and hence they should belong to metaphysics than mathematics.
Yeah, I see.
Okay, let's stop here, and inshallah, next time we begin from page 94, the second introduction. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.